Welcome to WCAT TV and radio. I'm Kiki Latimer, and I'm your host for the Catholic Bookworm. And I welcome Dr. Pedro Gabriel with us today. Welcome, author of The Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia. And I hope this is a topic of interest to many. I'm just finished reading most of the book. It was wonderful, clear, logical, so it was a great read. So I'm happy to have you here. So
it's my pleasure to be here.
How about you start us off with a quick prayer?
Okay. Please, O Lord, help us in everything we do, and please also help us during this interview, that we always will be able to convey your will, not our own, and help the Church, the Holy Father, and help those who may have troubles understanding, and those who are struggling. Please, God, help us do the best for everyone and help everyone who's watching.
Do you like to be Pedro or Dr. Gabriel? Which do you prefer?
Can be Pedro. It's completely fine.
Okay. I usually try to remember to ask ahead of time here. So tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Okay, so I am Pedro Gabriel. I am a Portuguese oncologist, and also on the side, since many years ago, since the time of Benedict, I have been doing also apologetics, and most especially after the election of Pope Francis as well, trying to clarify some of the misunderstandings around the Pope. And for that reason, I have co-founded some websites, Where Peter Is, The City and the World, and I have written many articles about it, always trying to dispel fake news about the Holy Father. And eventually I decided to also publish some books about some topics that were more recurrent during my articles in Where Peter Is. And the Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia was actually the first. In the meantime, I have published also Heresy Disguised Tradition, which we discussed in a previous interview. And I am also about to launch a new one, also by En Route, just like Heresy Disguised Tradition was from En Route Books and Media, which is Rigidity, Faithfulness, or Heterodoxy. As for the Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia, as I said, was the first book. It was published by Whitman Stock. It tries to answer the objections to those who would say that Amoris Laetitia was heterodox. In fact, the controversy around Amoris Laetitia was one of the main drivers for me and other people to co-found Where Peter Is.
Okay. So was there any particular event or moment that got you into this project? Because obviously you've put a lot of time and effort into it. It's so well done. You really dig into all of the misinterpretations and problems that many people had with it. Was there some moment that was the catalyst for this?
Well, as I said, it was mostly because when I co-founded Where Peter Is in 2018, at that moment, the big controversy was Amoris Laetitia. Around that time, also the controversy about the death penalty also started, but the greatest controversy was Amoris Laetitia. Everything else added up to that. So at that time, a big chunk of our articles was about replying to those objections. And I thought that, of course, as these objections started to accumulate and accumulate, on my end, I have at that time, we were expecting other apologists, more well-known, more established, other Catholic media to start being the ones to dispel these fake news. They are relatively easy to dispel, but there was a general disinterest among the classical Catholic media and Catholic apologists to tackle this. So me and the other co-founders of Where Peter Is were the ones who found that we needed to do this. And since there was so many objections, so many misinformation, so many misunderstandings coming from social media, Catholic media, even from the academia, even from some clergy, even some higher clergy, I decided to just compile everything in a single book, try to categorize it to be more systematic and to delve with each objection one by one and explaining how Amoris Laetitia is perfectly orthodox.
Well, you did a great job with it. My husband and I were particularly fascinated when the controversy broke out, because as converts to the faith, we had come into the faith with a group of people back in the early 1980s that we were friends with, that at the time I would have said were Orthodox Catholics. You know, they were in line with the Pope and the magisterium. In hindsight, I realized they were very, very conservative Catholics, but we were not aware of that at the time. But our coming from the Anglican Church and my husband from the Presbyterian Church, one of the things that was the greatest thing that moved us toward Catholicism was Peter, was the chair of Peter, was the magisterium, that there was an authoritative spokesperson and a group that could not fail on matters of faith and morals, that the church, couldn't splinter into like the 30,000 or more Protestant churches that tradition we were trying to get out of, where there wasn't authority. And so we were very excited, and we were surrounded by this group of people that, had the highest regard for the Pope and the magisterium. And everywhere we turned, it was follow the Pope and the magisterium. And we loved that. And then suddenly here we were, almost about 35 years later, and the same group of people were saying to us via social media and other things, don't follow the Pope and don't follow the magisterium, they're wrong. Because look at Amoris Laetitia. And we were like stunned by this. I mean, I can't even describe how stunned we were by the same people were saying, don't follow the Pope, don't follow the magisterium, follow us. And it was a fascinating phenomena to watch this unfold. And suddenly the Pope was no longer Pope Francis. He was being referred to as Bergoglio, his surname before he became Pope. He wasn't even Pope Bergoglio. He was suddenly just Bergoglio, sometimes with expletives sort of added onto it. And these were the same people who had brought us into the church under the beautiful chair of Peter. So it was shocking. It was absolutely shocking. We also, with my degree in theology, and both my husband and I had done a lot of study, we certainly knew and had been saying for years that people seem very confused about what a mortal sin is. And you bring that out right away in the book, that's the underlying problem. And we've seen in the literature very often, there's the term grave sin. And the term is used both for the objective moral sin and the subjective. So maybe you want to discuss that problem to begin with.
Yeah, I would just want to pick up on something that you said, because these people that you're talking about, that a few years ago, they were all about the seat of Peter. Nowadays, they are just saying, well, we're just following tradition. We are just doing whatever it is that we always have done. You're the ones changed. Well, no, they're not. They're not doing what they have always done. If you go back to the past, to before Pope Francis, who would mention that passage from Galatians, if anyone preacheth another gospel, even if it be an angel, let him be anathema. It was not Catholics who quoted that. It was Protestants. So, and you can search in Orthodox Catholic media, anyone would quote that Bible citation, and it would always be Protestants. And Catholics at that time, what they were doing, they would try to clarify that the Catholic Church had not preached a different gospel. Nowadays, it's the same Catholics who are going to use that biblical passage to go against the Pope, just like the Protestants did before. The controversies about heretical popes, Pope Honorius. You can try to search in Catholic forums, in Orthodox Catholic media, any Catholics saying that Pope Honorius was a heretic. No, at that time they were trying to clarify that no, that historical situation is more complex and more nuanced. It was the Protestants, the Eastern Orthodox, the secularists, these were the ones who brought up how Pope Honorius was a heretic. And now these are the Catholics who a few years ago were trying to dispel the myth that Pope Honorius was a heretic. Now they're the ones who are saying if Pope Honorius was a heretic, so Pope Francis can be a heretic as well. So no, they're not doing what they have always been doing. In order for them to not accept legitimate doctrinal developments that they were always a part of the church, they are going against tradition, their own tradition, the tradition of what they have been doing, what they had done many years ago, which was to submit to the Pope. And this brings me to your question, the mortal sin. I remember when I'm a cradle Catholic, but for many years I grew cold, and it was Benedict who instilled in me this interest in studying Catholic, my religion. And I remember when I went to Catholic forums at that time, there were many Catholics asking for help because I struggle with this sin and I cannot leave it, and I really want to leave it, but I can't. And now I committed it. I'm in mortal sin. I cannot receive communion, and I can find the priest to confess me. What am I going to do? And they were struggling also with scrupulosity. And at that time, everyone was saying, chill out a bit. You might not be mortal sin. You might not be mortal sin because in order for it to be a mortal sin, it needs three conditions. And this is in the Catechism, promulgated by John Paul II. It's there. It has always been there. I studied it at that time before Pope Francis. There's grave matter.
I mean, it's back with Aquinas,
Yeah, it's full consent. There's full knowledge. So if you're struggling so much, if you feel you wanted to not sin and you still sinned, you might not have given it full consent. So you might not be mortal sin. So don't be so concerned. If you discern that you're not in mortal sin, take communion. Right. This was completely uncontroversial during Benedict XVI's pontificate. I was there. And suddenly, when Pope Francis uses this same logic, but applies it to a group that, because of the discernment of the church, at that time, they were excluded from this logic because the church decided that it was a sin that caused great scandal, that was eroding the structure of society. So the church at that time decided, we are not going to apply the general logic of mortal sin versus venial sin to the divorced and remarried were excluded from the general rule. But now that Francis just decided to use the general rule, the uncontroversial rule, and apply it to this specific group of people, just because they were previously excluded from it, suddenly everyone's saying, oh, this is so confusing. How does it really work in practical terms? I don't know how we can apply it. Just apply it the same way as you've always applied it to the other sins. It's just so easy. At that time, I was completely baffled by why would this be controversial at all?
Right. I
And
mean, you talk about
remember,
this, you called it amnesia of the basic tenets of moral theology.
yes, it was like suddenly everyone had developed an amnesia to this basic tenet that before Pope Francis, everyone knew about it. What is full consent? What is full knowledge? How can we grasp it? How can we know if a person...
I almost had the sense at times with certain people and certain things that I read that there was which you didn't bring out in the book at all, but that there was almost an underlying sense of, look, we've been working really hard on our sexual sins, or we haven't had any sexual sins that we're going to discuss. But we've been working so hard on staying married and doing everything right. And now these guys come along and they're going to get a free pass, you know?
Yeah. The
I
idea of the
really
free pass
sensed that there was more to it than theology. That there was almost like, that's not fair. They're going to get away with something that I didn't get to get away with. So I don't like it.
That's a good thing, because I actually brought that up, not necessarily regarding Amoris Laetitia, but regarding the book Rigidity. It's that logic of they are going to get away with something, but well, you only have this idea if you believe that the things that they got were good.
Right.
So they are going to get away with sinning. Well, you have been saying for quite some time that sin is evil and that virtue is a good in itself. So if people keep sinning, what are they getting away with? They are doing something evil. Don't you think that if virtue is a good in itself and sin is an evil in itself, why are you saying that they're getting away with anything? They are not getting with anything.
Right.
They are enjoying themselves. So your heart is not where your mouth is. And Pope Benedict actually describes this as the sin of the eldest son, of the parable of the prodigal son. Pope Benedict already was onto this on Jesus of Nazareth, where he describes that parable, because it's not like the son, the oldest son, didn't want to just have a bad life with prostitution and gambling. Oh, he wanted it. Right. So he resents the father because the other son got away with it.
Right.
The only reason why he did not betray his father was not out of love. It was out of a sense of duty. But that sense of duty will erode the love for the father, because it will bring resentment. I wanted to be a sinner, but I couldn't. And this guy is a sinner, is getting away with it. That's not it. Catholicism says, no, you should not want to be a sinner. It's bad. It's bad for you. So these people are continuing to sin. Well, you should be concerned about that, yes, but not in the way of, they're getting away with things. No, that's already wrong-headed. And I also explained this, that, yeah, maybe you conquered a sexual sin, okay? I also bring that up on the book on Rigidity. You had a path where you conquer sexual sin, but after conquering it, you might think, I have reached the peak. But no, there are other sins lying after, namely the sin of pride.
Right.
And maybe you conquer the sexual sin, but actually the sin of pride, and this is something that Pope Francis teaches, and it's very traditional, but they don't like it, is that the sin of pride is worse than the sin of the sins of the flesh.
Right.
It is, right. Because and this is traditional.
Because sins of sexual sins stem generally from weakness, whereas the sin of pride stems from arrogance. You know, it extends from the heart, being just plain old rotten. It's
Yeah,
very interesting where you talk about pride. It's pride that leads us to think that when we disagree with the church teaching today, it is the church that is wrong and not
correct,
us.
correct.
And that
That
was this immediate reaction by many to Amoris Laetitia. It was like there was no sense of, well, maybe I don't have the right interpretation, or maybe I don't understand something. It was immediate, Pope Francis is wrong. And I was
correct.
fascinated by that. I don't know if we mentioned this on our other interview, but several years ago, there was another topic that I had really struggled with. Not a sexual topic, but I don't want to even mention, it was a teaching of the church, and I disagreed with it. And I had lots of philosophical and theological reasons that I disagreed with it. But I only spoke to a very small group of intimate friends about my thoughts on the matter. It was very, but I continued to pray about it. And it wasn't a feeling of, well, I'm right and the church is wrong, but it was like, why am I out of whack with this, with the church, And so I thought, well, I must be missing something. What am I missing? Or are they missing something? But, there was this just silent prayer for about a year and a half where I just was like, I don't get it. I don't get it. Something's not right. And then I just remember this one morning standing at my kitchen sink looking out, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, there was another thought, another possibility that I hadn't considered, a way of looking at the problem that was entirely new to me. And it was just given to me like a gift. And I realized that explains why that could completely explain why the church takes a particular stand on this matter. So it was wonderful because I was open. I believe I was open to finding out why am I wrong? So it does take at least a few grains of humility to just wait. And one of the things you mentioned in the book was that there was no waiting after Amoris Laetitia. Everybody just jumped on their private bandwagon. Putting things out on social media, public letters, the dubia, yelling and screaming from the rooftops. Sometimes people who had barely read the document or hadn't read the document at all were yelling from the rooftops.
Pope Francis doesn't think that chapter 8 is central at all. He has said at least twice that he's saddened that people are only focusing there. Yeah, right. And that the whole document should be read in its entirety. And it's such a beautiful document. And and you showed precisely what an attitude of a Catholic should be. And this is also something completely traditional, that the attitude of submission of mind and will. It's not like we accept everything just because the church teaches it, but we have to come from a place where we believe that the church is the one who is guided by the Holy Spirit. I might be guided by the Holy Spirit or not. I don't have that certainty. I don't have that power. So if the church teaches something and I don't agree with it, I should take it. My point of the point where I should stand is I should assume that I'm the one who is missing something. And you talked about how they probably struggled with sexual sin and now they think that other people might get away with it. But I believe that it's even worse because from a very, it's more a mentality of, for years, I have told people that the others, should change their minds to conform with the church, the liberals, the progressives, the gays, the pro-choicers. They have to change their mind and accept the church teaching. But Now that they are in the same situation,
Right.
they don't apply that logic to themselves.
This is
So
amazing.
church doctrine was not a truth that you want to bring others to, even if they believe something else. Church doctrine for you is something that you use to tell others what to do. But if someone does it to you, no, you cannot tell me what to do. I already know everything. I already know what church doctrine is, not the Pope. And this is not Catholic tradition. They might say that they are doing what they have always been doing. Maybe they are, because maybe they never struggled with a teaching before. But this is not what Catholicism has historically been. Right. And now they are frustrated. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned that suddenly we had Catholics, and I want to mention before I go on to this point, I think the people that we heard from, the media, the social media, that a particular group of bishops, I think they were really a small minority, but a very loud, small minority. Many people in the pews, the average Catholic in the pews that got wind, will never read Amoris Laetitia, but got wind of a lot of it, would turn to us and say, this makes sense. This makes sense because I know of this case or that case or my children or a difficult situation. And there was just that sense of the faithful that said, I have never believed that in this particular, with these horrible mitigating circumstances, that this young couple or whatever are in mortal sin. And they have struggled and they have continued to bring the children to the church and they have not received the Eucharist. Or in some cases, they have been allowed. But I think there were many of the normal faithful who aren't on a bandwagon who rejoiced in Amoris Laetitia and said, finally, what we've always understood about mortal sin in other situations, like the young girl who's forced to have an abortion because her mother drags her for one, that she's not in mortal sin. Maybe the mother is. It's a grave, horrible wrong, but she's not. And they had this understanding. So I do think that this small minority, very small, but just extremely loud and extremely well connected to the media, has just made a mess of this document for so many of the faithful who have embraced it and have said, finally, the Pope is saying what we've known in our hearts about a particular situation. But you mentioned that suddenly people in the group, the loud group, were saying, I follow Jesus, not the Pope. And of course, that was the Protestant tradition we had come out of. So I think I'd love you to speak to that because, we would say to people, well, that's not possible.
What is a heresy? The heresy is not just saying something that goes against the Catholic faith, but if you go to the etymology of the word, it means to separate. So usually a heresy separates something that cannot be separated, and after doing that separation, they reassemble it with that error there. So yeah, I follow Jesus, not the Pope. No, you cannot separate one from the other. You follow Jesus by following the Pope. If you don't follow the Pope, you don't follow Jesus. The Pope is the vicar of Christ. And no matter how many fake news you find that Pope Francis disowned the title, no, he didn't. The title is still there, okay? He just shuffled the title to another section of the annuary, but it's still there. So Pope Francis is still the vicar of Christ. And if he's the vicar of Christ, you follow Christ by following the Pope. And this is Catholic tradition, period. So again, try to find an Orthodox Catholic who, before the election of Pope Francis, would write in a major Orthodox Catholic publication saying a Catholic can follow the Jesus by not following the Pope. You don't find it.
Right.
You might find an odd article here and there, but it's not. You have to struggle to find it because it's not there. This is not tradition. This is not what Catholics have been doing all this time.
Right. And it's been clear all along that, this requirement of assenting to teachings, assenting to development of teaching has always been part of Catholic understanding. We don't have a static, tradition, that, our understanding develops greatly as we move along. And that even if theologians may be allowed to not so much withhold assent, but, have an opportunity to discuss the matter, that's done as a private, quiet thing. Again, not up on a soapbox, not on social media, the way it was done with this document. It was suddenly like all the rules changed overnight.
Yes.
And
yes.
And that does sort of bring us back to that prodigal son. The prodigal son story is, as soon as he comes home and he's forgiven, all hell breaks loose at the house because, like you're saying, the elder son doesn't like it. He behaved himself until then. That's always a fascinating parable because it contained so much truth.
Yes, completely. So, and that's the rupture. That's perfect. That's precisely the rupture in their praxis, in what they have been saying and what they've been thinking, what they've been writing. That's the rupture. There is a rupture here, and they don't even notice it. In order for them to focus on this minutia of, there was a change here before this Amoris Laetitia. This group could not take communion unless they had these situations, unless they fulfilled these conditions. And now they have different conditions to fulfill in order to receive the sacraments. So there is here a change, but in order for them to be able to maintain this unchanged, they have to change everything else. Everything else as pertains to the church, and they turn it upside down. And it's as you're saying, Donum Veritatis says very clearly, yes, theologians, when they're discussing matters that are not infallible, they can bring that concern to their superiors. But again, their attitude should always be to find the truth because something might be missing on my understanding. And if that theologian does not find what he wants, he's to be humble and silent, not take recourse to the media. And this brings me also to the dubia, which I also mention in my book. What is the attitude underlying the dubia? It is, I don't understand this. The Pope is the arbiter, so I'm going to ask him so that I can understand better what's happening. I go to the Pope to understand, his answers are for me to understand. But no, the people who ask the dubia are like, I already know the answer to this question. I want to know if you, Pope, are going to answer correctly. And since you refused to reply, or they didn't even give him time to reply, it was 2 months. In my book, I show that one of the dubia, the fastest reply dubia that I found at that time, took 3 months and a half. So they give him like 2 months to reply, and then they just bring it to the media to pressure the Pope to reply, which is a complete contradiction of Donum Veritatis. Donum Veritatis says, Don't go to the media to pressure the hierarchy to give the answer that you want. This is a complete subversion of the purpose of the dubia. The dubia are not to judge the orthodoxy of the Pope. It's for you to get answers from the Pope on questions that you honestly hold.
It was interesting to my husband and I because we knew quite a lot of the writings of John Paul II and Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger. Their writings certainly, helped to bring us into the church. We came in under JP2, but the implication with the dubia and with the whole controversy was that like overnight, Pope Francis had written chapter 8 and just sort of thrown it out there and turned everything upside down, when in fact the seeds of chapter 8 are in the writings of John Paul II and Ratzinger. They're there. In fact, there's something almost identical to chapter 8 in Pope Benedict's writings, and he had asked that it was published, then he pulled it back and said, I don't think the church is quite ready for this yet. We're going to hold off on it. But he had already written chapter 8. And so it was really fascinating to us.
If you're talking about during his youth, as a theologian, I don't know if that's what you're mentioning, but
it may have been an earlier writing, but it was already, the thoughts.
He actually went beyond chapter 8. He actually went beyond chapter 8. What he proposed at that time was much more lax than what chapter 8 is saying. But when Pope John Paul II on Familiaris Consortio said, no, it's like this, Ratzinger obeyed as a theologian. So, and people might say that Pope Benedict would have trouble with Amoris Laetitia. How? During his youth, he had proposed something that was even more extreme. In his proposal, the couples, they could continue having sexual intercourse. The divorced and remarried couples could continue to have intercourse. They didn't need to discern whether they're mortal sin or not. They just needed to have passed, but they didn't know to understand if they didn't know any discernments. They only needed to pass by a penitential path. Like after a few years living together, they have proven that they are true to one another, so they can just be accepted as a true couple, which is something that is similar to what the Eastern Orthodox do, at least once. This was his proposal. Amoris Laetitia has nothing to do with that. Amoris Laetitia is much more. It's faithful to what John Paul II and Benedict wrote. It's not that suddenly these couples can just blow off church teaching. No, they are still divorced. The divorce is not accepted by the church. Remarriage is not accepted by the church. What happens is that they are sinning, but as sinners, we are going to apply the general rule of the distinction of mortal sin versus venial sin. We're going to apply it to them because until now, they have been excluded from that general rule that is applicable to every other sinner. That's it. So, of course, Benedict Ratzinger at the time showed how a theologian acts. If the magisterium says something and you don't, and it goes against what you proposed, you retract it. But Ratzinger was even more. He was even more extreme than Amoris Laetitia.
Interesting. You in chapter 4, and I love that you brought this up, and I love that that Pope Francis quoted it on Amoris Laetitia 351. He quotes from Evangelii Gaudium, where he says, "I want to remind priests that the confessional must not be a torture chamber, but rather an encounter with the Lord." And to me, that is such a beautiful statement, because people are afraid of confession, And a lot of all of this revolves around, obviously, the Eucharist and confession and a personal sense of sin and people struggling terribly with their lives. And often, as Pope Francis mentions in Amoris Laetitia, with children caught in the crossfires and sometimes not being taken to church because the parents can't receive the Eucharist. So the children aren't taken to the church. So you're losing the children, you're losing the grandchildren. I mean, many of us have seen these terrible situations in our families, with people in irregular marriages, irregular messes of one sort or the other, and the children are being lost. And you know, the confessional does become a torture chamber. And the whole concept of the sacramental encounter with the Lord gets lost in this rigidity, which is your next book. It gets lost. And it's terribly sad for many families and children who don't even get an opportunity to be brought up in the faith because their parents are in some mess that they had nothing to do with. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true, because another principle of Catholic theology is that the good of the souls takes preeminence over everything else. And what we have here is people who are not in mortal sin, they derive benefit from the grace of the sacraments. Mm-hmm. They do. That's also Orthodox Catholic teaching. People who are not in mortal sin derive benefit from the sacraments, namely the Eucharist. So these couples who are struggling with sometimes dramatic situations, they need that strength. They are the ones who need it more. And this idea that we have this idea nowadays, and it's very noticeable, at least in America, that people like to police the Eucharistic lines. Who takes communion, who doesn't take? This person shouldn't take communion. But it's not your business. Your business is with you. Is with you. Oh, but it's a public scandal. Well, you're also creating public scandal with that. You don't know how this person is struggling or not. And if this person, you don't know if this person is mortal sin. No one knows. You can never know the state of the soul of anyone, not even the greatest sinner, not even the greatest sinner. And this is something difficult to accept, that it's true. Even for the biggest sinner, that you might think this person is being delivered, you never know you never are 100% sure. You can even go to 99.999% sure, but never 100% sure that this person is mortal sin. And if this person is not in mortal sin, then this person will derive grace from the sacraments. So you should be happy that the sinner is receiving the Eucharist. You cannot, it's not your place. The place is for this person has to do their own discernment with the Lord, with their confessor, with their spiritual director. It's their business. Right. And now the children, you also bring it up, and I also talk about this. I write about a case study from Father Paul Keller that also made the rounds in the 2010s, 2018 or something like that. I don't remember, but Father Paul Keller also brought up a theoretical case study in which the child was losing her faith because the mother was suffering so much because she could not receive communion. So these children are going to get radicalized against the church because they think, my parents love me so much and they love each other so much, and the mean church is excluding them.
Right.
Now,
it's terrible.
This is not good for the souls, for the good of the souls. And now just because you stick to the rules in a rigid way, you are endangering those souls. The overriding principle is the good of the souls. And when Pope Francis says that that controversial footnote, that the Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but it is a medicine for the weak, he is almost verbatim quoting Pius X. And Pius X, when he said that in Sacra Tridentina, also said that the main function of the Eucharist is precisely that. It's not to validate the person. It's the main purpose of the Eucharist is to help those who are struggling with sin to get rid of it. It's not the honor of the sacrament. Yes, you should honor the sacrament, but above that is the main purpose of that. Because Jesus did not institute the Eucharist to be honored like that. Of course, he should be honored. But if he wanted to be honored, he didn't need to create the Eucharist. He could have been asked to be honored in any other way. But what he wants with the Eucharist is to be inside us, to transform us from the inside. So if a sinner can get it, he should get it. That's what the Lord wants. That's why he created the sacraments. The sacraments are for our sake, for our salvation.
Right, right. I do think it all goes back to many people simply having that concept, and partly because it's messed up in the literature, a grave sin, when they mean it objectively as a grave matter, and a grave sin as a subjective moral evil. And in many quarters, I run into people that will say, for instance, abortion is always a mortal sin. Adultery is always a mortal sin. Fornication is always a mortal sin. And when we stop and go, whoa, 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 there's the objective matter. Then there's full consent to the will and a complete understanding that it's a grave matter. I think often, of certain people I know that they don't always make it to Mass on Sunday. And not for grave reasons. They just, but they don't have at all a full understanding that it's a grave matter. Given the culture, given their lack of formation, they don't think it's a grave matter at all. It's not like they're like flipping God off and saying, I don't care that it's a grave matter. I'm not going to go. They don't believe it's a grave matter. They don't understand it's a grave matter. So there's very little intellect at all going on there. And so we have these objective moral wrongs. And I remember years ago, Professor Fritz Vanish did a wonderful article on moral right and wrong, objective moral right and wrong, subjective good and evil. And but unfortunately, the literature isn't that clear. So, we hear this term, a grave sin, and you often don't know whether it's referring to objective or subjective. And so you always have to sort of help people clarify the difference between those things.
I actually, in the book, I actually cite Pope John Paul II in Reconciliatio Penitentia. Pope John Paul II acknowledged in that document that the Church had not been always very precise in the way she defined grave sin. Sometimes grave sin means mortal sin, and sometimes grave sin means sin with grave matter. And sin with grave matter can be mortal sin or not, according whether there is full knowledge or full consent. So some of the confusion may stem from that, but I also believe that I still don't believe that accounts for all the confusion, because as I said, this distinction between mortal sin and venial sin was widespread and well known before Amoris Laetitia and before the election of Pope Francis.
Right.
Sincerely, there's something else going on here, and
yes.
I think it has to
Politics.
do with trying very hard for Amoris Laetitia to not be considered Catholic teaching and to not be followed.
I do know we don't have that much time, and I could talk all day with you, but I do want you to touch on the distinction between the law of gradualness and the gradualness of the law, because I think that's an important point that Pope Francis brings out in Amoris Laetitia and you bring out to clarify in the book. But maybe for our listeners, you could clarify those two things.
As you said, mortal sin has grave matter, full knowledge, and full consent. Those three. And of those three, one is objective, grave matter, and the other is subjective, full knowledge and full consent. And when I mean that this is subjective, I don't mean it in a relativist way. It's not like I have my truth or you have your truth. No. A girl that is forced to abort because her mother forced her to, a teenage girl who is forced to abort because her mother forced her to, and an adult woman who aborts because it's just not convenient, they are not sinning in the same way. Okay, the grave matter is the same, is abortion in both cases, but full consent is not being given in equal measure. And this is also objective. It is an objective fact that both of these women are not equally culpable. I think we can all agree with that. So when we say subjective, it's not leaving to each one to decide what is good or bad. No, when we say subjective is we take into consideration the circumstances that each person has, and we gauge the culpability of this person. And I also explain this in the book. Usually, when you see that Amoris Laetitia is being called that they are trying to hammer a moral theology error on Amoris Laetitia, subjectivism, relativism, situationalism, proportionalism, all of those things. Those errors have to do with the grave matter of sin. They say abortion or divorce or these things are, or remarriage again, these things are sinful or not according to the circumstances. And that's erroneous, but that's not what Amoris Laetitia is all about. Amoris Laetitia is not talking about grave matter. Amoris Laetitia is not saying that one sin ceases to be sinful just because you are in a bad situation. No, it's still a sin, but the culpability of the people that are in that sin is different according to whether they have full knowledge and according to which they gave full consent. And this is Amoris Laetitia. This is Amoris Laetitia. So Amoris Laetitia is on a different level. And you cannot say that Amoris Laetitia is heterodox or that it's situationalist or proportionalist or relativist, because if you do, you're saying that Pope John Paul II and Benedict were also the same, because these principles are there. Even in Veritatis Splendor, where Pope John Paul II goes against these errors, explains these errors, John Paul II in Veritatis Splendor makes the distinction between mortal sin and venial sin, based on these full knowledge and full consent. So those are different things. And the law of gradualness and gradualness of the law, you can also explain them based on this distinction. Gradualness of the law means that the law itself is gradual. So the law applies to me, or the law applies to you, but it doesn't apply to me because I have a justification for it. No, law of gradualism is a law. It's not saying there's law for some and not law to the others. No, it's saying there is a law that states that people achieve the moral perfection through stages. They begin on a weak stage and they gradually become stronger. And so the degree of demanding that you give to the person that is still at the beginning, that's still in a weak stage, is not the same as a person who who's already in a stronger stage. That doesn't mean that there's a different law for everyone. No, but the demands of law, the consequences are different.
And the culpability. Yeah,
the culpability. I would say that, for example, an analogy would be the law of gradualness would be to say, you need to exercise to get good health. I don't need to exercise because I found a justification for myself that says that I'll be healthy no matter what, whether I exercise or not. That's a lie. That's a lie. But I tell this lie to myself in order not to do something that is hard for me. So there's you need to exercise. I don't need to exercise. But the law of the gradualness of the law is, okay, we both exercise, but I am less fit than you. So instead of going to lifting 100 weights, I will just lift a bit. And maybe today I will be too tired and I will have to call it a day. But next day I'll keep pushing forward. I will keep pushing forward. It's not that something is different from you and me, but the demands are different, and the weakness, the strength of each other must be ascertained individually. That's it. But in some cases, the objective is the same: to achieve the maximum health using exercise. This is an imperfect analogy, but I think it might help clarify the difference between the two.
That's good. Thank you. I think, the Amoris Laetitia is long overdue, that looking at mitigating circumstances for people in very difficult situations in discernment with the priests, that internal forum of discernment is just vital to the church today and for the faithful. So I thank you. It's a wonderful book. It's very logically set up. You can get it through En route and Amazon. It is The Orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia by Pedro Gabriel. Is there anything that you wanted to make sure was in this interview that we missed? There's so much in the book. I mean, we could easily talk for another hour.
I think we covered the major points, and of course, we can never exhaust everything that has to be said about this topic, but I believe it was a good summary of the major points of the book. And now the rest of the book, it's mainly dealing with the specifics, whether Amoris Laetitia contradicts Familiaris Consortio or not, or whether it contradicts Veritatis Splendor or not, Humanae Vitae, whether it is a proper doctrinal development based on the 7 notes of Cardinal Newman. But those are specifics, but the general points, they are this. It's the difference. It all hinges on the traditional venerable principle of the distinction between mortal sin and venial sin, and the sacramental consequences that come from that distinction.
Well, I look forward to reading your next book. And the title of your next book is Rigidity,
Faithfulness, or Heterodoxy.
Beautiful. Well, thank you.
I hope that it will be released very soon.
Well, then I'll probably see you for an interview sometime maybe in the late summer or fall. It'd be good to talk to you again. Would you end us with a prayer, please?
Yes. So again, bless us, O Lord, and bless everyone watching. We give thee thanks for everything. We give thee thanks for Pope Francis, and we give thee thanks also for Amoris Laetitia, and for having a church that guides us and knows how to help the sinners, everyone, to achieve salvation in the generosity of the Lord. And I would just finish with an Our Father and an Ave Maria. Pater noster, qui es in celi, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, dimiti nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tu, Iesus. Sancta Maria Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostre. Amen. Gloria Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sanctus, sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
Thank you so much. I look forward to talking with you again.
I look forward also. Thank you for inviting me.
Delightful always. Thank you, Pedro.